Hello, my name is Joseph Williams. I'm an Assistant Professor of Counseling and Development at George Mason University. Welcome to part 2 of our module of Overcoming Stereotypes in Law Enforcement. In part 2, we're going to spend a little bit more time actually talking about specific, concrete, evidence-based strategies that you can use to overcome some of the implicit stereotypes that you might hold. I want to start this with a preference that compared to the science and the research we see on the existence of implicit biases and stereotypes, and the negative consequences of them, the science or the research on the ways to actually mitigate these implicit biases is relatively young. And we're still actually trying to figure out how do we actually control for or actually mitigate the impact of implicit bias. And so what I was able to do is actually pull from the research and the literature, which you'll see cited throughout part 2 of this module, as well as the reference list to this presentation. So please feel free to go back to review those articles, those websites, to actually get even more information than what we're able to actually present here today. The last part of the preference I wanted to state is that we're going to look at personal strategies that you can use and in my own professional practice, I'm really a big advocate of actually looking at personal as well as institutional types of changes we can make. Given our time limitations, I just really want to focus on the personal things that you can do starting today, starting tomorrow, to actually start to undo or unlearn some of the stereotypes that you hold. For more information about the institutional types of strategies, please feel free again to refer to our reference list. So what I was able to do is actually to identify 7 strategies that could be used to actually help address implicit stereotypes. I'm going to really quickly run through those, and then we're going to give each of those their own attention. Strategy 1, to recognize that you actually have stereotypes, right? To acknowledge, that may be an even better word, that stereotypes are a normal thing, that we all have them, and just to come to grips with that. Second strategy is to identify what those stereotypes and biases are and what are some instruments that are out there that can help you do that. Thirdly, we're going to talk about increasing exposure to counter stereotypical individuals and groups. Look at some of the myths behind that, as well as some things you can actually do to make that work on your behalf. How do we decrease stereotypical inducing stimulus? So how do we actually guard ourselves? We guard our conscious and our unconsciousness from the environment, which is full of stereotypes and those types of messages. Increasing perspective taking, practicing making counter-stereotypical associations, and then seeking out information on implicit stereotypes, biases, which is part of what this training is actually about. Right. So the first 2 strategies, recognizing that you have stereotypes, while that seems kind of common sense, actually when we look at research, we see that people who actually have a motivation to not only recognize but acknowledge the stereotypes that they have, they're more likely to be successful in mitigating those biases or stereotypes that they hold. So even the desire to want to operate on a non-stereotypical basis as much as possible actually leads to better results for those individuals who are looking towards becoming more egalitarian in their operations or practices. Step 2, identifying what those stereotypes and biases are. And so, again, we can't fix anything that we don't know is broken. And then how do we actually define what are those associations? What are those negative associations we look? One of the things that I tell my students all the time in other helping professions is that a problem that's well-defined is halfway solved. So we can actually define what it is, what are those negative associations, we're on the right path towards actually addressing those. One of the main instruments that are out that I'm really I endorse a lot is the implicit association test, which I believe is housed at Harvard University. The reference is listed at the back of this list. This is a test that actually tries to measure unconscious biases or associations that you actually may have, and it provides those results. And so you can look at race, you can look at gender, you can look at sexuality, you can look at different demographic variables and see, do you have implicit biases as it relates to this group of individuals. And once you know and you can actually identify what those groups are, then you can actually use strategies 3 through 7 to address those particular groups. So it's really an important starting point to figure out where are your biases and where they may lay. And so with slide 3, strategy 3, increasing exposure to counter-stereotypical individuals. This is a slide where you see more information on because I want to debunk some myths. So there's the contact hypothesis, right? The idea or the thought that if I actually expose myself to others by going into environments that I'm uncomfortable in, that I'll be able to kind of debunk some of the myths or stereotypes that I have about that group. Research shows that that actually is not true. Not only is that not true, however, actually just going into another group where you're different from those individuals, it actually might lead to a heightened level of stereotypes or biases towards that group. And so there are certain conditions, if you're going to use that approach, that have to be available in order for that to actually be correct. So just a couple really quick, is having personal relationships. So it's not enough just to attend a multicultural event or a community event, but are you establishing, do you have personal relationships with members of that group, whatever particular group that you're actually you're targeting? That makes it a little bit better. Having typical as well as inconsistent members of that groups. So are there certain stereotypes that you hold in this group of people? Are there members who actually hold the stereotype as well as those who actually don't hold the stereotypes? There are exceptions to it. So there's a mixed group. And this helps actually control for contrast effect, right? Our ability to say, okay, this group is all one way or this group is all another way. But to say that, there's variations to behaviors, there are variations to members of this particular group. So we can, for example, African American, low-income communities, members of that group, there are variations as it relates to individuals. Widespread inconsistency, you want to find groups where maybe a majority of them are actually counter-stereotypical. So some of the stereotypes that you may hold as well as it relates to the level of education, or whether they're criminally inclined, or whether there's substance abuse issues, things of that nature. So people or groups that actually challenge those stereotypes consistently will help you actually to challenge them on an unconscious level, as well as repeated inconsistent. So there's widespread inconsistent, where a majority of these people actually are inconsistent to my beliefs about them. Then there's consistent, that I see it over and over. So it isn't just an exception. So I can't just explain it away as some type of phenomenon where there's a small few individuals who don't live up to these stereotypes, but mostly the group does, right? And so when you're talking about being a part of groups or immersing yourself in cultural experiences from those that are different from you, you want to make sure, again, that you have relationships, or you're trying to build them, that they're providing individuals or groups that actually have inconsistent information that kind of counters your stereotypes about that group. So again, I just wanted to spend a little bit more time on that one. The fourth strategy is to decrease stereotype-inducing stimulus. This could be the news that you read or that you watch on TV. This could be the books that you read, the movies. Those things out in the environment which actually confirms certain stereotypes, or perpetuate or maintain or create certain negative associations. The more you can guard yourself from those types of stimuli, the better you'll be able to actually counter them once you're exposed to them. And let me go back to 4 really briefly. Not only avoiding them, but actually to replace those with more counter stereotypical types of information, right? And so that's a really big one too I wanted to hit on. Strategy 5, increase perspective taking skills. Again, this is the conscious practice of trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes, kind of an empathetic approach. But this is one of the things that I tell my students is to play a game. So when you see a situation or when you see something, analyze it from different points of view. So try to think of what are 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 alternative explanations for this behavior that I'm seeing. What are 3, 4, 5, or 6 alternative, I guess, information or explanations, as I was saying, about why this person is acting a certain way, why they're in a certain situation, things of that nature. So practice thinking about multiple ways of understanding an event or an individual or their behavior or reaction thereof. The last 2 strategies, strategy 6, practice making counter stereotypical associations. Again, another game I tell my students to play that if done enough, it actually starts to actually work in the subconscious, the unconscious, where I start to actually associate let's say African American males between the age of 16 and 24 with college graduates, right? I just start to make that association. So when I have free time, I start to make associations that are kind of counter the stereotypes. And again, that may sound kind of silly at first, for lack of a better words, but again, you make those associations enough, and what you're trying to do is actually retrain your unconscious learning process to start to believe that and counter the stereotypical informations that you have which is important because, again, as we saw in Module 1, our stereotypical beliefs and behaviors actually lead to actions. The very last strategy is to seek out information on implicit stereotypes and biases, such as modules such as this, that you make an effort to actually go out to training about learning about the differences between different groups of people, increasing your appreciation of diversity and the different ways in which we're diverse even within the same communities. And so these are 7 strategies that you can actually take on a more personal level and put them into practice tomorrow if you want to actually start to work towards addressing or uncovering your own implicit stereotypes or biases. I thank you for your time, and I hope that the information has been helpful.